Welcome to another episode of Extraordinary Leadership Podcast. So today in the studio, I have Navid Nazemian, who is an executive coach specialized in executive transitions that we'll dive into today. And he's awarded as World #1 Executive Coach by CEO Today. He's also a book author, Mastering Executive Transitions, and he brings 20 years of experience from a corporate world where he served as a leader, as an executive in various HR roles in renowned companies. And I want to welcome you, Navid, first of all, to this conversation. I know it will be very rich, exploring your story and, of course, your fantastic support that you do for executive leaders. And above all, unpacking what executive transitions actually are. So thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Dagmara, for the warm welcome. And I am very much excited to be part of this podcast of yours.
Thank you. Thank you. And before we dive, Navid, into, the main topic, which is executive transitions and why it's so important for leaders, it will be awesome to hear your story. And actually, curiosity for the listeners is what brought you to this topic after all?
Sure. So first off, as you stated in the introduction, I spent 26 years of my life working for some of the world's most admired companies at country, regional, and global roles. And it really was an eye-opening experience for me to learn from the very best. And despite that, you really find out that as soon as you hit the executive floor, certain things just don't work anymore. And onboarding and transition is one of those. So what got me to get excited about this topic and really start to do a little more research about it was the fact that I yet have to see any company that does this at a world-class level. And so that was kind of the start of my mission, as I say, when I go on big stages and present this topic to large audiences. I say I'm on a mission, and my mission is to help as many executive leaders to succeed as I can, because I know that 40% of them, unfortunately, don't make it.
Which is a pretty large figure. So what were the challenges, I'm curious to hear, and I'm sure listeners as well, in those roles that you faced that brought you to this realization and discover your mission, right? The realization that there is a gap and discover your mission.
Sure. So allow me first by saying that I have 156 citations in my book. So the appendix is 22 pages long. So this book is not just written based off my own memory or my experience of going through these, wonderful companies to work for, but it's really a very rich way of coming to the topic. So I just want to be very clear about the fact that this is not an autobiography type book or, this is how I think leadership should be done. And now please everyone go and copy it. So this is really a very much widely kind of research topic. And so coming back to your original question as to what gets in the way, there's an entire chapter dedicated to this topic. In that chapter, I cite the top 10 reasons for executive transition failure. But if I wanted to, shorten that into 3 grouped reasons for executive transition failure, the 3 reasons are people, culture, and politics. So it's very rare that the company hires a CFO and he or she isn't really good with the numbers. It's almost impossible to hire a chief people officer who doesn't really get the people agenda. So it's not the technical skills that get in the way most often, but it's oftentimes what we in HR call the soft skills. As we know, they're very, very hard to learn and demonstrate.
People, culture, and politics.
Yes.
About the politics, quite a lot can be told, isn't it? So still before, unpacking this topic, going back to you, what were the challenges that you faced as an executive, especially in those 3 dimensions?
Sure. I can cite a concrete example of how I really failed badly in my career. And so this is me working in sales for 6 years, and I had this desire to want to work in the HR function. And at the time in Germany, nobody really was game. And so they all look at my CV and said, "Oh, sorry, you have applied for the wrong position. We got great openings in sales for you." But I had this idea that I wanted to work in HR, coming with a sales background. And so it only took one individual to really trust me to do that. And I'm allowed to mention her name. Dania Frech is her name. She was the head of HR working for Adidas at the time. And she gave me a chance. And she said, "Look, I'm going to hire you. You're not my typical hire or atypical hire here at Adidas, but certainly you will be the first assistant HR manager that I'm going to hire. This was the lowest level HR role I could get that has been selling our products previously. So you have the customer and the product experience. And I find that is a unique way into getting you into the company. And so I had 3 incredible years at Adidas. I was the happiest you can imagine. And I knew that I wanted to get international HR experience under my belt. And at the time in Adidas, the corporate functions were not doing international assignments. So I knew that this is a bit of a dead-end road until or unless I wanted to change my ambition to just, grow in the within the country. And so anyway, the first offer that came my way that gave me that international HR experience I took on, and that was with GE. Now, mind you, I lasted 8 months at that company. And at the time, GE was the world's most admired company. 350,000 people. Jack Welch had just stepped down. He was considered to be the most iconic CEO of any company. A lot of S&P 500 companies were targeting the second and third tier GMs and presidents within GE to come and take over the top job in the company. So GE was literally considered the best school for leadership. And yet I failed horrendously at the time. And the reason I failed was that I made one of the top 10 mistakes, which is I started to copy and paste or replicate what had made me successful until then. So if I think back of Adidas, it was very much a family feel. It was all about the team. It was never about the individual. We did not have an individual multiplier for our bonus schemes at the time. It was all based on the team effort. And so that was really something that I learned very well. And when I went into GE, who had, come up with a 9-box grid, and essentially everyone was taking out their elbows and wanted to take into box 1, that is when I didn't quite understand and adjust my style of leadership and my understanding of organizations to the new context and organizational culture. And that is probably the number one reason why I had to resign and say goodbye to what could have been a fantastic career with GE.
While you were talking, I had several scenes in my mind coming from my own past life as working in a corporate or also leading, as well as leaders that I've met at the different levels. So I can see that we can fall very easily to that trap of, knowing because of experience. So we carry a lot of biases, and the more senior we become, we believe we know more. And that's where I can see this mistake can creep in. So I can imagine that has been a difficult time for you, first of all. How did you go about that?
As a leader, you're likely to face more than once a challenge coming your way. So what you do is you go back to square one and make a new plan, and that's what I did. So again, I decided to leave the organization. It really wasn't right for me. And that being said, I have only good things to say about GE. I just made all the rookie mistakes that you could expect someone to do. With that in mind, I went back to the drawing board. I activated my network. I started looking into the market. And within 2 months after that, I landed my first international HR assignment. And so that's what I was very much determined to do. And that's what I got to do.
My curiosity goes into what is the commitment that you took at the moment where you realize, okay, that's the time to leave because it didn't work out. I'm sure there has been a reflection as well, apart from, reaching to the network and landing a new job. And the reason I know it, because I also experienced, of course, failures at such levels, which made me, not only reflect, but take a different decision and stance next time.
Yes. So I guess there is an element of resilience that's been building up in me over the many decades. The first time I had to face the tough reality of life was at the age of 13 when I came to Germany without speaking a word of German and having to establish myself there. And so, again, it was, you could say I was thrown into the cold water and it was a very deep one and I wasn't really necessarily the best swimmer. But, 3 years after that, I was the best in my school and I was speaking German fluently. So I guess there's something about the aspect of resilience that you start to pick up at various stages throughout your life, for whatever reason, make you the person that you are. And I think that really helped me at the time I needed it.
Where was the time that you came into, thinking about writing a book, thinking about transitioning career and thinking about starting with your mission?
Sure. So first off, you mentioned Marshall Goldsmith, and I have him in high regards. I'm also part of the coaching community that has been put together And he very kindly wrote the foreword to my book. So I have the highest respect for Marshall Goldsmith. But I wish, like Mara, that I was that strategically foresighted 10 years before my departure to say, okay, I'm going to start writing this book. On that day, I'm going to launch it. 6 months later, I'm going to jump ship from the big corporate ladder and establish myself as a coach. And then a year later, CEO today is going to name me the #1 coach in the world. I wish I was that strategically foresighted. The reality is I wasn't. It all just happened. And so, one of the little secrets about my book was it's gratifying that everyone sees the success and it's an international bestseller and all that. It was really hard to write the book. I really struggled with writing the book. And a little known secret is it took me 7 years to write this book from cover to cover. And after about 6 years, I'd only produced 60 pages or so. And so it really was, I was thinking that I probably don't have enough life left in me to finish this book because, a book, it's on average is 250 pages or so. And, if you continue to write about 10 pages a year, you can map out how long it's going to take you to finish the book. That was the first part of it. And it was really hard. And after about 6 years, I was actually considering to publish what I had collected, which was essentially the research for the book, as a white paper and just be done with it. But as I'm sure you will appreciate that the resilience kicks back in and it's like, okay, you seem to have really tried everything and you don't seem to be making quite the progress you want to make. Who could help here? And, you could say, as a coach who's been supporting many, many executive leaders with their transition challenges, I stumbled upon someone who's a book writing coach. And so his name is Professor Eric Costa. He teaches at Georgetown University, and within 6 months of working with Eric, not only did I produce a book that became an international bestseller, but I really was able to put it together in a way that I feel deserves my name on the cover of it. And then it, was good enough, I guess, for Marshall and other people to say, I'm happy to write the foreword and support your book as well.
Amazing, yeah. So I was wondering, was initially the intention to write a book for others, or was that for yourself also to reflect on this whole process?
So the intent was always for others because, again, I knew that, I was nearing the age of 50. I was nearing the quarter of a century of working in organizations. So I always had in the back of my mind something that will outlast my corporate career and my life, quite literally. And that's one of the few things that people know about writing a book is that, it will be around when you're not around anymore. And that's just in itself a wonderful gift, I think. And so this is why it took so long to research the topic. This is why it was so hard for me to really come to terms with what is the skeleton structure that I want to write in. And this is what Eric helped me the most. I mean, he's helped, I think, something like 2,000 people to publish the book. But 95% of those books are in the fiction space. So he's not an expert in leadership. He's not an expert in nonfiction books by any standard. But this is what a good coach does, which is it helps you to come to terms with the struggle that you're faced with and to figure out a solution that works for you. And so what he really gave me was a high-level framework that I could write towards. And that was really what got me kind of going again. That was what really made me to not only produce another 180 pages over that 6 months time period, but, within a year after starting to work together, publish a book that became an international bestseller.
Absolutely fantastic. It's such a good example, a great example of how coaches can shift around, transform the of views or infuse the achievement of any goal that you aspire. Yes. So and yes, coaches do also need coaches. That's why we take those decisions for different reasons.
That's right.
So in your book, you mentioned about this 40%, which is a big percentage. 40% of executives are failing into first 18 months. Where is this guy coming from?
Yeah. So there are 5 independent studies that all come to the very same conclusion. Some differentiate between internal promotions and external hires. Others don't do that. But the most validated one I would like to cite is from Heidrick & Struggles, which is one of the largest search firms on the planet. And they have placed over 20,000 executives over a 10-year time period. And if you were to go back and look at the initial date of appointment and 18 months into that appointment, 40% were not around anymore. And so that is the most staggering kind of, survey I could find on the 40% failure rate. To be perfectly honest, the first time I came across it, I thought this site may have misquoted. It happens all the time. It's 14 and somehow it turns to be 40, or it's 4 and somehow it cuts into a mistaken 0. But it actually is 40%. Yeah. So 4 out of 10 leaders don't make it at the very top of the house when they are going through a major transition.
Let's unpack a little bit beneath each of these 3 kind of pillars.
Sure.
So what are the main challenges that an executive leader is facing with, or main mistakes that I know you're referring in your book as well, in that box of people?
Yes. So first off, allow me by saying that when I was doing the deep research for this book, that was the easiest part of my research. And the easiest part was to find spectacular failures of very prominent CEOs at the very top of some of the world's largest companies. And so again, I'm not claiming to have met these people or to know the real reasons for their failure, but I think anyone that is a public, company CEO is really portrayed usually very well in media and outlets. And that's what I have based my research on. So allow me by using an actual example. And sure. I would like to use the example of Dr. Leo Apotheker, who again, I have never met in my life. So he was headhunted to come and lead Hewlett-Packard at the time. And Hewlett-Packard, quite frankly, was a champion in its own right. Hewlett-Packard was a champion in the printing business. They had started to foray into the server business. And so they really were, really, really successful at the time. And the board of directors decided that HP needed to start moving into the direction of the Googles, the Apples, and kind of more of the digital technology type companies. So they said that whilst they have been very widely successful in the past, if they were to continue that journey, they are unlikely to continue to be successful. So they brought Leo Apotheker in, and the mandate was very clear. We want to move this culture from where it is to where we would like it to be. And so he came in and he went, the first couple of months that he spent as a newly appointed external CEO, he went on what is oftentimes called a CEO listening tour, which is you travel the world. HP had, over 100,000 employees worldwide. So I was traveling all these different countries, meeting with employees, having large town hall meetings, meeting key suppliers, key accounts, and so on, and trying to understand HP and making sense of it. But unfortunately, as it so happened, he was very forthright with saying that the culture must be broken and that what has been the prevailing culture is not going to be fit for the future. And not only that, but he started to rave about his previous company's culture and what a great, amazing culture it was, and how much the HP needs to move towards that culture. And that is the very same reason he was actually brought in to help the HP to make that shift. And I think you don't really need to be in a betting office to start betting to see how the employees are starting to turn against that CEO, who quite frankly is not listening at all, but he's preaching down to the masses of people that he's meeting how crappy the culture is that he's finding and how much they need to shift, or else, the doomsday is going to be around. And so this is the one big mistake that he made along some of the other mistakes. And so that led to his departure within 10 months of being appointed. And, his pay package was north of $10 million. But in my book, I write about the ripple effects of these transition failures. And if you have a CEO at the group level failing, I make the case that failure is 30 times the total package of that CEO. And so you can, write out in dollar terms what is the damage to the organization because of the morale going down, because of the company being leaderless for a time, because of executive leaders who report to the CEO starting to ignore them.
Trust.
And so, in my book, I write about the fact that any new executive that's incoming needs to earn the right to bring about culture change. You can't be coming in and a week after your appointment starting to talk about how crappy the culture in the firm is, even if objectively that is a good thing to say. The reality is, how about if Leo Apotheker were to be if this was a Netflix movie, we would just rewind to day one, and he would still go on to his listening tour and use this more than this, and actually getting into conversations with the staff and their suppliers and key accounts to learn more about what is it that we want to maintain and preserve, and what is one or two things, if they had a magic wand, that they would like to have changed in the foreseeable future. And on the back end of that 3 months tour, to come back to the masses to say, these are the amazing things that have made us successful, we would like to preserve and maintain. And these are the one or two things we need to shift because I have heard you say that to me. Now imagine what is the engagement behind that sort of announcement. Yeah. Imagine what is the real effort that people will go and make to go above and beyond the call of duty to move the needle towards what is the desired future state to the current one. And so this is just one concrete example that I wanted to share as to how an executive has made all the mistakes. And at the same time, if they were to be supported maybe by an executive transition coach, if the HR person was a little more on the money, how they would have avoided the early big mistakes that they made that ultimately resulted in their failure.
Thank you for sharing that example, because so many memories came through where, my mind when you were sharing. It's such an important aspect to listen and actually to be inclusive in this whole process of onboarding yourself in the organization, to really understand what is going on and how what is there has been constructed, because there has been a reason why the company is where the company was, a culture was, right? I think the second, which came through my mind when you were sharing, is probably lack of appreciation for that, which is verbalized. Because when we are coming as leaders and trying to portray ourselves, that we know, we come from a better experience. So we know, again, quote by quote, a little bit better, right? How to turn us around, and what has been established maybe has not been the most fantastic. We still need to inspire the people that created it. We're not firing everybody and bringing completely new people. So this is creating the disconnect, most likely what in this example has happened, right? So it was also not really an inclusive way. And I love that you mentioned about this in terms of communication, how smartly it can be communicated by not only listening, but also replying to the ideas and concerns and worries and needs of the people that are part of the culture.
Yes.
So that's such an important thing of not discrediting what has been done, however, building on it. I think that's what came across to me when you shared.
Yes. And by the way, allow me by saying that the same is also true if the leader were to wait for too long to bring about culture change. So it's about the earning the right. So it's about the timing as well and the how. And the timing is crucial, because imagine if Lea Patika was brought in with the big mandate by the board to change the culture around. And we know that a culture change doesn't happen overnight. And at the same time, if you were not to touch anything and run with what the ship is looking like and how it's being geared up for the next 2 years or so, you will have a very hard time to change anything around, because people will say, well, you have been part of this establishment for 2+ years and you haven't made a single change to what you found. So it can't be that bad after all. And so again, it's both the how and the timing. And the other aspect I want to add to what you just said is, when you started talking about firing people coming in, there's actually another study I cited in my book, which is from Russell Reynolds. And they cite two things. One is, if you look at any major appointment at the top of the house in any company, over 90% of the cost that is associated with that appointment goes into the recruiting process. So this is the fee to the headhunter, maybe some diagnostic tool, maybe some, the costing of internal stakeholders making time to interview their candidate and so on. And then there is some, invoicing and so on that happens. And less than 10% of their sum is spent on that same hire once they have been hired into the firm to make that hire successful. So in my book, I talk about the imbalance of investment. Many firms seem to be falling into the trap of, just paying a search firm the fee that they can to hire the very best candidate and then let them to sink or swim. So that's the first aspect of what I wanted to share with you. The second aspect I wanted to share is, it's also done by Russell Reynolds, interestingly enough. And they say that if you are being appointed into any C-suite role, after about 3 or so months into that position, you have what is called an executive hunch. So you have enough data points to know that, let's say you have inherited 10 members of your leadership team that are reporting into you now as the group CEO. If you have significant doubts that 1 or 2 members of your team have what it would take for you to execute on this strategy, you might move ahead and upgrade and refresh those 2 roles. Because if you were not to do that and you were to wait because you're worried that you might come across as the cutthroat type CEO that's just been appointed and is now, killing everyone, all you're going to likely collect is additional data points to what you inherently knew was true after about 3 or 4 months. And so again, the advice is not to come in and, take the gun and start killing people. But the advice here is to really pay close attention. And after about 3 or 4 months, sit down, maybe with your HR person or your executive transition coach, to do an honest assessment of the inherited leadership team and to call out if there is 1 or 2 members of the team that you don't believe have what it takes. Then you might as well move fast, because that is what is going to give you a high level of performance and is going to save the company ultimately money down the line.
Yeah, making sure that you have the right people in the bus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it can be a pretty courageous act for some leaders, isn't it?
Yes.
As you mentioned, for fear of rejection, fear of making the wrong choices because you just maybe 3 months there. So one thing is, of course, how you feel, what's intuition telling you. Another is, of course, you knew in a company still, right? To some extent, because those decisions, you don't want to, as you mentioned, wait for 2 years or something down the line. So yeah, there's a lot of psychology behind, or a lot of fears so related. So I can imagine that, of course, a lot of leaders, as working with many of the leaders, I know those fears are real, having been in various roles as well. Then I know that basically so many fears and so many mental games we are playing on a daily basis. So what shocked me, I think, when I'm listening to you is how poorly executives are supported in it. Because, when it goes about spending into support of leadership in organizations, usually the first budget is more welcome to be spent on higher senior roles, right? Senior and executive roles. Hearing from your, statistics and experiences that it is such a low number, that's really is astonishing, to be very honest. Because the higher you go in an organization, the more you actually need that support.
Yes. So I raise my hand and say guilty as charged, Your Honor, because I have been part of those HR teams that have signed off gigantic budgets for executive leadership development, and all it had was to send them to IMD, INSEAD, or some other reputable organization. I'm not saying that's a wrong choice, by the way, but to get some degree or certificate only to be headhunted by the next firm and move on. And so what is the real value of those? And so again, the global figure is 116 billion that is spent on development globally. Now, what I'm suggesting is that instead of, sending executive leaders all the time through degree type courses and certificates and what have you, to also consider how you can support your incoming executives that need a transition support. And this is all I'm asking for. So again, the idea is not to stop spending money on learning and development, but really to be more mindful in supporting arguably what is the most crucial hire for your organization, which is the C-suite. And so that is what I am, advocating for, and that is what some of the best companies on the planet do. I mean, I've had the fortune and pleasure of working with 30 plus companies by now as an executive transition coach, and so I know that they are keen to invest. That's the 90-10% kind of balance, to get the balance right, because arguably no executive could go through the same onboarding program as a call center agent as being hired into the same firm. And so you need to have something that is a lot more tailored and a lot more measured towards what the executive needs, rather than having a generic compliance, generic onboarding training for the masses of in the same organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on board with you, because actually any of these onboardings and support, when you think about the broader scale in an organization, it's just tailored to what's the role and what's the expectation of that individual. So there's different expectations to a CEO. And of course, different loads of risks and responsibilities and costs associated with that for the whole company, not only in value or money, but also reputational costs, right? And damages and trust, which are then, of course, translated to money, but also equally to every other layer. So I think what I would like companies to move into is to really focus on equipping, and supporting with equal measures all of those different leadership layers, because equally that's what forms the culture, that's what starts to form the culture. And obviously the leadership team is, if there is dysfunction, if there's a unity, that is cascaded in the whole organization. So that's really the first lens to look whenever there's any dysfunction in the organization. We need to start there. and help different people in different levels as well. We talked about a couple of mistakes, and I'm sure there are much more in the books, and I'm curious to hear about other mistakes actually. So maybe before we go to some to your model, because I know you developed a double diamond model, so I'll be curious about that as well for listeners. Maybe there's a place for one more mistake that you could bring here from either this politics or culture or people that we mentioned, those three areas that are worth to mention today with listeners.
Sure. And I guess I would point out the politics one because it's a very, very much common one that I have faced. And by the way, Michael Watkins, my fellow author of The First 90 Days, refers to this as the corporate diplomacy challenge, which I think is a very, very nice word to describe what I call in my book, politics. And so it's the same thing. And funnily enough, when I have conversations with chief people officers, oftentimes what I hear is like, oh, we don't have politics in our company, thankfully, because it's our competitors' problem. And this is where I'm very curious to see if that's actually true. And I yet have to find a single company that doesn't have politics at play. And so the example I want to use is my own example of having worked in country type roles as an HR leader, in regional roles, but also at the global headquarter roles. So I have worked at the global headquarters for companies such as Adidas, Roche, the pharmaceutical company, BAT or British American Tobacco, and Vodafone most recently. And so I know, for instance, in Vodafone, I also worked in Germany. And so I know the major difference between working in a country role versus a global head office role. And I think it's fair to say that with the little sample of data that I have is that there are heightened levels of politics to be expected the closer you move to the center of gravity in any organization. And so, arguably I didn't do that with GE because I think I would be just sucked into the black hole of what is called politics. But it was already enough for me to work in a country operation in that organization. And so what I would say is things that I learned the hard way. And this is why I say that, if anyone is looking to work with a coach, one of the top 10 criteria to make sure that the coach is right for them is to look for someone who's coming with scar wounds. And by that, I mean someone who's been there and done that. Now, I know this is highly contested even by fellow coaches who say a coach does not need to know anything about the customer's universe because they have all the frameworks and they can help them anyway. Yes, and if you are a chief sales officer who's struggling with a particular topic in your current position, I would highly recommend to work with someone who's an established coach who may have a deep pocket of expertise in the sales function and who may have struggled a few times along the way. Because again, they will be able to understand you at a different level of maturity than a coach does, who's just finished a degree and never worked in an organization and has been coaching for 20 plus years successfully. So this is what I learned. And a few things I want to mention without mentioning the name of the company are things like, I remember having an Irish boss and it was 3 months into our working together and I had a hard time to understand what he actually wants me to do. Right. And so there is something about that working environment that made it very hard for me to really understand what he actually wants me to do. So I had to read between the lines all the time. Another example I want to share is when I worked for another organization at the global head office. And I had technically on paper, there was a delegation of authority table for major initiatives or, it was like tied to budgets and impact and so on. I had done everything by the book to be able to launch this fantastic program to develop HR leaders in a matrix type organization setting. And on the day I presented that to the HR leadership team, it was rejected. Only on the back end of that meeting, I understood what had happened, which was I had failed to get the buy-in of someone very influential on the HRLT who technically had nothing to do with this initiative, who wasn't even impacted by it. But because she was such an influential figure and I was so, rookie in my approach not to ask for her gracious approval of the same, that this was rejected at my presentation. And so these are just some examples to mention that although you go by the book and do everything right, you may still struggle badly. And this is something that an executive transition coach can help you unpack and work through as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's definitely worth to have someone that can introduce you to all those informal power plays in every organization, isn't it? Because then they were written. So Navid, you have developed a framework of Double Diamond and you are using that to walk through your clients, guide your clients. So tell me more about that.
Yes, sure. So it took me roughly a year just to come up with this wonderful framework. And this is regarding two things coming together. The first thing is I just couldn't find a suitable framework for executive transitions myself. And as I said, I have 156 citations. I think I've done enough research on that topic. The second reason I wanted to have a framework is because I wasn't just interested in the theoretical underpinning of why so many leaders fail. I wanted to be giving out a framework that actually helps them to avoid the biggest mistakes and have a much faster acceleration into the transition. Mm-hmm. And so that's why, I had to use my own framework in my coaching practice, and I had to come up with something that actually works. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to point out about the Double Diamond framework of transitions is, there's this other very famous book out there, which is called The First 90 Days, a book that I have the highest respect for, that sold over 1 million copies by now. It's 20 years old by now, and it's very dated as well. But the first 90 days is only one of the 7 phases that I describe in my Double Diamond framework of executive transitions. And so that should give you an idea that first 90 day or first 100 day or first 120 day, which are all copycats of the same idea, are nowhere near sufficient for anyone at the executive level to transition successfully into the role. So my philosophy and what I am suggesting to executive leaders is that a transition at that level is typically a 12 to 18 month journey. The first 90 days is only a tiny fraction of what they have to get right.
Yeah, I could completely see it. And, I was wondering, is that only valid for executive leaders? I think it's valid for every senior leader as well, right? The classical 90 days, which is, by the way, a good book for some reflective questions and guiding you in the first processes. But definitely your success in execution is actually just starting after the 3 first months, isn't it? The 3 first months gives you a great assessment, as you referred to the first example today in the podcast, to understand what is really going on, to understand the politics, to understand really where what people want, where the gaps and all of that, and to bring your awareness, your expertise into that, and start, of course, transitioning or painting the picture and painting the vision of where we want to go collectively, right? So it's totally on point to say that definitely 3 months is just, licking the surface of any leader coming to an organization to lead a major change, because that's what every leader does, right?
Yes.
Come to an organization to lead some form of change and elevating the organizational team to the next level.
And you make a very important point here, Dagmara, which is the first 90 days was written for anyone and everyone. And for that reason, it can't be fit or the top of the house. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is what is unique about the Double Diamond framework is that I'm speaking about phases and not levels or steps. And so again, if I'm a first-time manager, I loved reading the first 90 days when I was a first-time manager, because it gave me some ideas, and I was new in the role as to how to go about that. But at the top of the house, I'm unlikely to be a first-time manager. Sure. I'm unlikely to be the first time appointed into a position. So quite frankly, I need something that is a lot more sophisticated than that. Yeah. And the reason I went for the 7 phases and not the 7 steps is that I didn't want to be too prescriptive about transitions, because again, by now I have worked with 250 executive leaders to support their executive transition. And I yet have to find 2 that are exactly the same. And so the 7 phases are always overlapping. Some of the leaders that are coming to do the work with me have already skipped the first of the 7 phases, which is called the discover phase. This is your -90 to day 0 phase, which again, it never occurred to me as a good idea to start until you start in the role, to start to onboard yourself successfully. How about if you have already been announced and you've already signed your contract and you are announced to be the incoming chief people officer? Why do you have to wait until day 1 to start to onboard yourself successfully into your role? So there are concrete things you can do ahead of your actual start date to make sure that you set the ground. Absolutely. And, hit the ground running on day 1. And the other thing I want to say about the framework is that anyone who buys my book as a paperback or hardcover can also request to get their hand on what I call the workbook. The workbook is a 31-page actionable guide to put into practice the double diamond framework. So whether you're an executive leader who doesn't want to work with a coach and are competent enough to apply the framework to their own transition and benefit from it, whether you're an HR leader who want to support your incoming exec with a more structured, more mindful transition support, or whether you're a coach who's working occasionally or all the time to support senior leaders with their onboarding and transition, all these three groups would benefit from applying the actual framework. And this is why, I speak about, putting into practice or putting your money where your mouth is to come up with something that is actionable and implementable in the real life of executive leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what are those 6 other elements, Navid?
Yes.
Just that listeners know from the top.
Yes. So because I can never quite remember more than 3 things at any point in time, I don't know about you, but this is how my brain works. If you were to take the first letter of each of the 7 phases, you get to the word diamond. This is my way to remember those 7 phases. So
the first discovery, I think you mentioned?
The first phase is discover, which is the -90 to day 0.
Yeah.
The second phase is immerse. This is your typical first 90 or so days. The third phase is adapt. This is your month 4 in a role. There's this famous saying that every president or every leader in a company gets a 90-day grace period. And after that, there is an expectation that some things will start to move. So this is your adapt phase. The next phase is the one that starts with the M, right? This is the phase where you need to, this is your month 4 to month 6. This is the phase where you need to start to build some coalitions. This is the phase where you need to not only establish your own trust and credibility in the organization, but this is the phase where you need to start to get some people to believe in what you have to offer to them. This is the first, let's say, town hall people that have seen you in your listening tour that now start to believe in what you have to say. And this is why it's such a crucial phase. The next one is the operate phase. This is the phase number 5. And this is your 6 months to 9 months kind of in. And this is where I cite the example of Dr. Hannes Amesreiter, who was the CEO of Vodafone Germany, Vodafone Deutschland. And he was appointed at a time where Vodafone was nosediving in market share, in revenue and profitability. And of course, he had been in role for something like 6 months, and he was a telco expert. And that being said, many other experts had been tried and tested before, and they couldn't just turn the ship around. And this was the first time that he was very successful with a major launch of a new product. But not only that, Vodafone Germany started to improve and gain some early market share and improve in its profitability as well. And so this is why it's important that after about 6 to 9 months, you start to generate some results that people then start to believe in what you have to offer.
Forming the trust, right?
Yes.
Reliability trust.
The 6th phase is called nourish, and I had to use the dictionary to find a word that starts with an N at the beginning.
Yeah, can you imagine? From the diamond.
The nourish phase is what I just described, which is you start to earn the early, low-hanging fruits, start to materialize. So the market share goes up, your profitability goes up, whatever the major account you wanted to land has been landed. And so people really start to believe, even those that are sitting on the detractor kind of side of the scale, that no, this guy or this woman is really legit and has really a few ideas up their sleeve that seem to be working well. And the 7th phase, so the first phase and the 7th phase are the ones that are skipped most often, is called develop. And this is the phase that is easily skipped by the executive leader because, quite frankly, they have transitioned successfully and they're on to the next thing. And this is the phase that the executive benefits most from with an executive coach because they sit down, and I've done this many times, we call it a postmortem. We sit down and reflect back together on what's happened during the last 12 to 18 months. What were some of the major successes that the executive leader came across? What were some of the biggest failures and things that turned out differently than they expected? And what are some of those learnings? And with all of that in mind, this reflection exercise, we then look out into the future and say, what are 1 or 2 things they might want to do differently going through another transition in the future? And that's the 1st and the 7th phase are ones that are rarely written about, but those are the 2 phases that really have the biggest impact on the executive transition, which is another reason why the first 90-day approaches are nowhere near sufficient for an executive leader.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. And, I'm always thinking, okay, from the framework of extraordinary leadership, there are a lot of connecting points, and the reflection part and creating space for that reflection is so important habit for every extraordinary leader, I call it, to lead at executive level or lower levels in the organization. Because this is where we actually can notice and we can set ourselves, like where I was asking you, right? What were you doing after maybe a success or maybe actually a failure, right? Both of them we want to reflect on, because we want to see what helped us actually to get to our success, as well as we want to see the patterns that we want to break through so that we don't repeat them and we are more successful in another leadership role that we are aspiring for. And I can see how they see it very well. Plus, of course, Double Diamond is nicely accompanying the curve of change and a whole leading change in the organization, which is of course pinned into that. And me personally, I can see, of course, a lot of value why having, a partner, a sparring partner, someone who has, of course, been also in these roles and someone who has experienced failures and successes, and of course had a practical experience in being in a corporate world. That's a different story than someone that have not done it, to help executives into or guiding them in this process. But what would you say for listeners that maybe have not had yet, decided to take the first step, who are leaders listening to these shows, or maybe leaders in HR listening to this show? What would you say to them is why would they benefit from hiring a transition coach like yourself?
Yes.
I know we covered quite a lot of points today, but just, what is this why that you would tell today? What's the message, I guess?
Yes. Again, in my book, and this is actually one of the slides I use when I present this topic, I call it the business case for executive transitions. And I encourage people to take out their smartphone and take a photo from that, because that one slide includes 15 different studies that suggest why this is a worthwhile investment. Mm-hmm. And so just to give some ideas away, the first one is there are 4 independent studies that I cite in which they suggest that if an executive leader were to work with an executive transition coach, they reduce the risk of derailment by 50% or more. So if you are looking at the 40% transition failure rate, you are likely to reduce it to 20% or lower than that, just by appointing someone who is skilled and knowledgeable in this area. The second, and this is the most underestimated one, is that, even if you're internally promoted into the top job, it takes you anywhere between 3 to 6 months to start to give back to the organization. So the initial investment that has gone into you start to break even the productivity levels, is how I describe it in my book. And you're able to reduce that by 50% or more if you work with an executive transition coach. So let's say if you would take an internal hire to 6 months to come to terms with a new role and start giving back value to the organization, what would it be worth to the organization if they were able to do it in 3 months or lower than that? And so these are just some concrete benefits on the commercial side of why this is such a worthwhile investment. But there are plenty more. I actually cite 12 good reasons why any organization should be looking to intervene to support the executive leaders, and coaching is just one of the 12 that they can do.
I can see your sales background. Emerging is fantastic.
To my defense, what I can say is when I was writing this wonderful book, I was a busy HR exec and had no plans to jump ship from the corporate. So I really made the case as an HR practitioner, not necessarily as a coach who is looking to grow their business.
Yeah. But it's important to know those points. And of course, numbers also are important, because that's where you use an investment, or people invest, look at ROI, right? So
absolutely.
And then there are the other factors that obviously are important, which I think is interesting to read to your book, right? So that's where you're pointing out our listeners to go to. Very nice that you develop also a workbook that basically people can reflect on this or look into where to focus on in all of these different stages. And as you also mentioned, even if there are stages and defined times within this 18 months, I think you mentioned that before, that some people will go through them differently. And obviously the starting point will be different because their maturity as a leader will be different, right? Their mindset, their awareness, the consciousness will be different. So that will definitely influence how they go through these phases. And I believe also the speed and maybe how they go in, maybe they are faster in some of the phases and take longer time. Yes. So this is also not an expectation to any of the listener here that that's by the Bible, that's exactly how it needs to happen or what needs to happen, because there will be some deviations depending on where they are and, of course, where the organization is. So I think we could carry on this conversation because it's really very interesting. And I'm always amazed at how many statistics you bring to the table, Navid. I really respect a lot of that. So kudos for that. And I want to ask for the final message from, first of all, for yourself to the listeners, and of course, how they can connect with you.
Sure. So my final message is, don't take my word for it. Take it from some of the world's most respected leaders who have read my book and said very good things about it. And I think this is really, it's one thing if you fall in love with what you do, and I consider my book to be my second child. But the reality is that it's up to other people to make their own judgment. And I'm incredibly grateful for the likes of Dave Ulrich and Marshall Goldsmith and Hannes Ametsreiter, many, many more leaders who have, said that this is the compendium book on the topic, and there's no other book written on the topic that has really given these insights. Where to find me? I think LinkedIn is the place to be. I have a large following on LinkedIn. I have no VA or no PA managing my LinkedIn account on my behalf, so I am the person that's behind the LinkedIn page. I post at least once a week something related to thought leadership. I love to give value to my followers. You will never see an infomercial from me on LinkedIn. It's always a genuine desire to want to break down complex topics and to make them practical and implementable. And that's what I sign up for. And that's why a lot of organizations are seeking to do the work with me and people like myself.
Cool. Congratulations. I'm sure that, those companies that are listening or leaders that are listening here will definitely be interested into looking in your book and in your profile, and maybe downloading also the workbook to, that's what I would do if I was now in a C role and not having a partner yet to work with me to make the checkpoints, right? Am I doing? Am I not doing? And thank you very much for, sharing on the topic that you're passionate about. And kudos to all the great work that you do and awards that you are collecting along the way. And I'm looking forward to meeting you in another conversation. And thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Dagmar. I very much enjoyed our conversation.